Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Okay, so Mr. Gladwell is here today to discuss his new book, Outliers. Outliers is a book about success. It starts with a very simple question. What is the difference between those who do something special with their lives and everyone else? The book explores this question by examining the lives of the remarkable among us, the brilliant, the exceptional, and the unusual. Through his book, we learn that the way we think about success is all wrong. Malcolm Gladwell is a staff writer for The New Yorker and the author of 2 best-selling books, The Tipping Point and Blink. Please join me in welcoming Malcolm Gladwell to Microsoft to discuss Outliers.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. You know, I don't work in an office. I work at home, and I forget what offices are like. And I was around the corner, and I saw this big open refrigerator with all kinds of soft drinks. I was like, how cool is that? So I'm going to talk about my new book, which, you know, there are many things in it, and I can say all kinds of things about it. But I thought I would talk about an idea that is actually not in the book, but that I've been thinking about a lot since writing it, and which encapsulates a lot of what the book is about. And it's this idea that's called capitalization, and it is a concept that a very brilliant psychologist named James Flynn has written a lot about. Those of you who know something about IQ research will have heard of the Flynn effect. That's James Flynn's idea. And he's written a lot about this concept of capitalization, which is what is the rate at which a society capitalizes on its potential? In other words, what percentage of people who are capable of doing something actually end up doing that thing, right? How efficiently do we make use of the talents within a given group of people? So let me give you an example. I don't know how many of you read Michael Lewis's book, The Blind Side, which is this extraordinary book about a young man in East Memphis, a teenager, who's 6'6" and 350 pounds, and he's discovered by and adopted by a wealthy white family, and they realize that he's an extraordinary athlete, and they work with him until he becomes one of the finest offensive linemen in the country. And in fact, he's about to be drafted into the NFL as many years later and make a gajillion dollars. And it's this extraordinary story, but the part of it that always stayed with me when I read it was that right at the very end, the kid, whose name is Michael Oher, says that he's from the slums of Memphis, East Memphis, and he says, if everyone who I grew up with who was into football, who had real ability in football, actually ended up playing football, they'd need to have 2 national football leagues. And what he was saying was that that East Memphis did not do a very good job of capitalizing on its athletic ability, right? And so Lewis actually follows up on this, and he does this. He talks to some people in the East Memphis school system, and he asks them, what percentage of kids in East Memphis who get a college athletic scholarship actually end up going to college? And the answer was 1 in 6, which absolutely floored me, because I would have thought that when it comes, if there was one thing in America that we were really good at doing, it would be exploiting the athletic ability of our youth, in particular of our African American youth. I would have thought that in an inner city area, the capitalization rate for sports would have been 90%. But in fact, what we learn in East Memphis is that the capitalization rate is 1 in 6. It's 16%, right? So now think about it. If in something that we care about as much as sports, right? There's possibly nothing in American society that we devote more time and attention, intellectual resources to than the maximization of the professional sporting experience. In something that we care that much about, our cap rate is 16%. So how high must it be in things that we don't care that much about, right? That's a very sobering notion, and it says that as a society we have an long way to go towards properly maximizing the human potential of our members. And so I realized when I thought about that book that Outliers is really about that question. It's about identifying sources of constraints on capitalization rates and figuring out how to remove them. So what I thought I'd do is just sort of talk about a variety of these constraints. What are the kinds of things that lower cap rates in any number of different areas of human endeavor? So one obvious one is poverty. When that kid, Michael Oher, who grows up in East Memphis, talks about what a tiny fraction of the kids he grew up with who had athletic ability actually end up going to college, what he's talking about is poverty. East Memphis is one of the poorest neighborhoods in the United States, and we know that that kind of poverty makes it very, very difficult for those who have an ability to do something to actually end up doing that very thing. And that's sort of an obvious constraint on capitalization, but one of the things I think is true of poverty is that we tend, even as we acknowledge its importance in constraining capitalization, we underestimate just what a powerful constraint it is. And let me give you an example. In the book I talk about the famous Terman study that was done in California. And this is a study done in the 20s, began in the 20s in California. And Terman, who is a psychologist at Stanford, in fact, the Terman who was the first dean of engineering at Stanford. In fact, isn't there a hall called Terman Hall at Stanford? How many people went to Stanford? That's this guy's son. Anyway, little side fact for those of you who went to Stanford. He does this thing where he gives an IQ test to 250,000 California school children, and he basically identifies the top 0.1%. So kids with IQs of 140 plus, genius level, essentially. And he tracks those kids for the rest of their lives, for 50 years. And he's trying to figure out what happens to them. And it's his notion starting out that he thinks, because he's so invested in the notion that IQ is the single most determinant of life success, he thinks what he's done is identified the cohort who will turn out to be the leaders in academia, in industry, in the people who will end up running all the organizations and being the top politicians and the top intellectuals, right? So he follows them for over the course of 20 and 30 years. And 20 and 30 years in, he realizes actually it's not true at all. And that these kids turn out, when they turn out to be adults, they have a variety of strikingly different fates. There is a small group that does very well. The top 15% do actually occupy positions of real prominence in society. Then there's a big group in the middle who have pretty average lives. And remember, these are kids with adults with genius level IQs. And the majority of them they're kind of like have moderately successful professional lives. And then there is a chunk at the bottom who are by any measure failures, whose lives turn out by any kind of occupational yardstick to be massively disappointing, who do not seem to make use of their extraordinary human potential at all. And the question that Terman has to wrestle with is, why did that group fail? What's the difference between this group who did beautifully well and this group who did so poorly at the bottom? And he runs through, this question obviously obsesses him, and he runs through every conceivable explanation for that difference. And he says, is it their personalities? And it's not. And he says, is it their habits? Is it their, it goes on down the list. And he realizes in the end that the answer is really, really simple. And that is that the kids who did best, these genius kids who ended up succeeding in the world, were the ones who came from wealthy households. And that the genius level kids who ended up utter failures in life were the ones who were born into poor families, right? Born into families where parents hadn't gone to college, where there weren't books in the home, where there wasn't the kind of cultural and institutional support for a habit of learning and a habit of intellectual activity. What he was saying, in other words, that even if you endow a child with a brain that is a 1 in a billion brain, that is not sufficient to ensure the success of that child. That poverty is such a powerful constraint on capitalization that it can reduce that genius child to a lifetime of worse than mediocrity, a lifetime of really profound disappointment. So that's the first constraint. Like I say, it's the obvious constraint, but I think it's important to impress on for all of us to understand that poverty is probably a bigger constraint than we think, particularly those of us who are not intimately connected with it. We may tend to underestimate what an extraordinary impact that has on limiting people's ability to do well. So let's talk about some other constraints that are maybe less obvious. I got really interested in this book in looking at the composition of elite sports teams. And if you do that, you find out all kinds of strange things. So at one point, I looked at the roster of the 2007 junior Czech hockey team. Now, I did not pick that team I picked that team at random. I just was interested in that's an elite team. It was the second or third best junior hockey team in the world, after, of course, the Canadians. I'm Canadian. So it's a really elite team. These are the kind of kids who go on to play in the NHL or in the elite adult leagues in Europe. So I'm going to read to you the birth dates of the members of that national Czech team 2007. January 3rd, January 3rd, January 12th, February 8th, February 10th, February 17th, February 20th, February 24th, March 5th, March 10th, March 26th, April 22nd, May 5th, June 6th, July 2nd, July 19th, July 20th, August 15th, August 25th, August 31st, November 29th, and December 31st. Now, what's strange about that list? Right? Did you notice? 11 of the 20 names are born in January, February, and March. It is a massively skewed distribution of birth dates towards the first 3 months of the year. Now, that is not something idiosyncratic to the 2007 Czech junior hockey team. In fact, if you look at any elite hockey team anywhere in the world, and for that matter, any elite soccer team anywhere in the world, you will see the same skewed distribution. You will see that an overwhelming number of the members of those teams are born in January, February, and March. Now, why is that? The answer is that the eligibility cutoffs for age class hockey and soccer throughout the world is January 1st. And in both those sports, we very, very aggressively recruit the best and the brightest kids at a very early age. So we go and we look at a group of 10-year-olds, and we watch them play hockey or soccer, and we pick the best, right? And we select them out, we put them in all-star teams, and we give them special coaching and extra practice time and more games and encourage them, right? Thinking that is the best way to capitalize on the talent pool in that particular sport. Right? But think about it. When you're 10 years old, who's going to be the best at a particular activity, physical activity? The oldest kids, right? The kid who was born in January has 10 months of maturity on the kid born in October. And when you're 10 years old, 10 months is an extraordinarily long period of time. It can be 3 or 4 inches in height. It can be the difference between being clumsy and being massively coordinated. So we think we are picking the best, and we're not. We're picking the oldest, right? And then we take the oldest, and we give them special coaching and all kinds of extra opportunities and all kinds of extra games. And lo and behold, 10 years later, they really are the best, right? But it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right? We created the conditions that made them the best, and foolishly thought we were actually identifying real talent. Now, you only have to look at that and realize what an extraordinary constraint on capitalization that is, right? Logic would tell us that the distribution of hockey ability or soccer ability should be even throughout the year. There, by rights, should be as many great soccer players or hockey players born in December as January. But when we look at these teams and we see they're overwhelmingly weighted for the first 3 months of the year, that suggests that that the capitalization rate for hockey must be less than 50%. Right? We are leaving all of the talent born in the second half of the year on the table. Now, there's clearly a very easy solution to that problem, and that is that when we put together leagues for soccer and hockey and any other sport in the age class arena, we should have different streams for kids born in different months. We should have 3 parallel leagues. One for kids born in the first 4 months of the year, one for kids born in the middle 4 months, and one for kids born in the last 4 months, right? And have them develop independently until they're in their mid-teens, and then select. It's a really simple way, and if we did that, we would double or triple our capitalization of talent in that particular realm. Now, why don't we do that, right? Because we refuse to admit that our own rules, arbitrary rules, constrain capitalization. And we cling to a naive belief that these meritocracies that we have constructed in this particular realm are entirely rational and efficient and fair. So this is a second constraint on capitalization. It's the stupidity constraint, right? It is our inability to understand that there is something deeply arbitrary and unfair in the way we have written the rules on which a meritocracy exists. Right? Now, for those of you who think that that is a minor issue, and that, so what if those kids can't play hockey? You know, why can't they just play another sport? Let me remind you that this is true of many sports. I'm going to give you the birth dates of the 2007 Czech junior soccer team. Ready? January 1st, January 3rd, January 5th, January 12th, January 26th, January 27th, February 1st, February 14th, February 20th, February 21st, February 24th, March 15th, March 26th, March 29th, April 16th, May 20th, May 26th, June 22nd, June 24th, August 18th, and September 26th. If that's not a stupidity constraint on capitalization, on football ability, on soccer ability, in a country, by the way, that cares more about football than, you know, perhaps any other, I don't know what is. Right? We need to take, in other words, very seriously the question of how we choose to structure systems of meritocratic systems. And this also, you can apply this exact same logic to educational opportunity. If you look at how well kids do in school, based purely on their birth dates, on whether they fall into the youngest, oldest, or middle age cohort in their class, you see exactly the same patterns. In fact, there was a beautiful study done recently that tracked thousands and thousands of kids across the West and tracked them all the way through to their university level and found that kids born in the relatively youngest cohort of their age class were 11% less likely to go to college than kids born in the relatively oldest cohort of their age class. 11% is a huge difference. And it says that that is 11% of kids whose opportunity is being, whose human potential is being squandered, right? Completely foreclosed. Why? Because we are so stupid as to organize our elementary school education without reference to the obvious fact of biological maturity, right? It is a glaring example of how stupidity constraints dramatically limit the capitalization of human potential. So third constraint, and I can go on and on about constraints, but I'll stop with the third one. This is in many ways the most fun one and the most controversial one, but I think it's worth digging into. And it's what I would say is an attitudinal constraint on capitalization. So I have a whole chapter in my book which is about this question of why it is that Asian kids do so much better at math than their Western counterparts. Right? Now the numbers here are irrefutable and they're extraordinary, the differences in mathematics performance between kids in Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan, and kids in America, Germany, England, or what have you. In fact, we just got a round of results from these international math test comparisons, I think a couple of weeks ago, and we're talking, the difference is not this, the difference is that. And if you look closely at trying to figure out why, it seems to be the case that the reason for that difference has to do with attitudes. It has to do with what is the attitude with which the child in those two sets of cultures approaches a math problem. And it seems to be the case that when Asian kids sit down and face a high school math problem, they have a different expectation of what solving that problem entails. They have an expectation that if they apply effort to the problem is solvable. Whereas when we look very closely at the attitudes of Western children, they seem to have the attitude that their ability to solve that math problem is a function of their ability, of their innate ability, something they either have or they don't. Right? And that attitudinal difference seems to make have a profound effect on the ability of kids to do well at math, because as it turns out, the Asian approach to mathematics is the correct one. When I say correct, let me give you an example. So these international math tests that we give to kids around the world. They're called TIMS. We give the TIMS every 4 years. It's the same test to kids all over the world. And that's how we come up with these rankings of how countries do. Well, when we give the TIMS to kids, at the same time as we give them the math test, we give them a questionnaire. And the questionnaire is really long. It's 120 questions long. And it asks them all kinds of questions about that will be useful to researchers. So how many hours do you study? Do your parents encourage you? Do you like math? You know, all those kinds of things. But it's really, really long. And it's so long, in fact, that most kids don't finish the questionnaire. It's just too long, right? So a couple of years ago, this really brilliant guy called Erling Boe at Penn decided he would rank the countries of the world by what percentage of questions on the questionnaire their kids finished, right? And you know what he found when he did that ranking and compared it to the ranking of countries on the world by what percentage of questions on the math test their kids got right? The two rankings were exactly the same. And when I say exactly the same, I mean there was a correlation of 0.9. 0.9. In the history of social science, there has never been a correlation of 0.9 between two. It's the same thing. If you want to know how good a country does at mathematics, in other words, you don't have to ask that country's kids any math questions. You just have to make them do a task that requires them to sit down at a seat for an extended period of time and focus on a task. Right? And if they can do it, they're good at math. Really, really fascinating. In other words, what we're saying is when we look at Asian cultures, what we are seeing is this difference in mathematical ability. What we're seeing is not some underlying difference in talent or aptitude for mathematics, but a difference in capitalization. That the Asian cultural attitude about work has the result of being a far more efficient way of capitalizing on math ability than Western attitudes towards work. Right? And that tells us where the deficit in our mathematical education in the Western world lies. It's not in our curriculum, it's not in the quality of our teachers, it's not in the size of our classrooms, it's not in the amount of money we spend on schools. It is the attitude in the head of the child as he or she sits down in 11th grade and does algebra or calculus, right? And by the way, nor is it a problem in our genes, as some people would like to say. There's a whole bizarre argument that Westerners have an inferior set of genes when it comes to mathematics than Easterners. You know, a totally ludicrous and unnecessary step in this argument. No, it's about culture. It's about a difference in attitude and about their ability to far more efficiently capitalize on the abilities of their kids. Now, why is this the case? I mean, I'll just digress for a moment. A really, really interesting question is, okay, if Asian cultures have profoundly different attitudes towards effort when it comes to mathematics, why? Right? Where does that come from? And nobody knows. But in my book, I venture what I think is a plausible explanation. And that is that I think it has to do with patterns of effort laid down in historical agricultural practices. That when you look, what is the thing that Hong Kong, South China, South Korea, and Japan all have in common? And that is they are historically rice-growing cultures, right? And what is distinctive about rice growing? It is the most labor-intensive and cognitively complex form of agriculture known to man. We know, so my father's European ancestors in the Middle Ages in northern England probably worked 1,000 hours a year as peasant farmers. So what that meant was they worked from dawn to noon, 5 days a week. On the weekends, they drank themselves silly. And during the winter, they slept, basically. And they got lots and lots, I don't know if you know this, but a peasant in medieval England got lots and lots and lots of holidays. That peasant's counterpart in South China or Japan in the same period would not have worked 1,000 hours a year. They would have worked 3,000 hours a year. For the simple reason that rice farming is just it is not a difference, not just a difference in degree from wheat farming, it is a difference in kind. It's a whole different way of working. It demands that you wake up at dawn and work all the way until dusk. It demands that you work on the weekend. In fact, there's a wonderful Chinese proverb that I quote in the book, which is, a man who works dawn to dusk 360 days a year will not go hungry, right? Which encapsulates the difference between Eastern and Western agricultural practices. No, my peasant ancestors in northern England, it would be inconceivable that they could call that a proverb. They would have said, the man who works 175 days a year, dawn to 11, may or may not be hungry, right? Well, my argument is if your culture does that, if that's what you do for 1,000 years, that attitude is a deeply rooted part of your makeup. And when your kids, even if they didn't themselves work in a rice paddy, when they sit down and face a calculus or an algebra problem, that legacy, that attitude towards effort and persistence translates beautifully to that most modern of tasks. Right? And means that your culture will do a far better job of capitalizing on its innate ability. Now, is that the whole story? I don't know. Probably not. There are probably all kinds of other explanations as well, and I get into some of them. But I think it is important that when we look at things from this perspective, to try and answer questions using history and culture as our guide. When you think about problems, in other words, from the perspective of capitalization, I think you look for answers in different places than when you have a far more simple or more reductive approach to these kinds of things. Now, why is this discussion of capitalization so important? Because I think when we look at why certain people or groups succeed in the world, our default explanation is always that those differences in success reflect underlying differences in ability. And we forget about how much poverty, stupidity, and attitudes are far more important constraints on capitalization. You know, I remember I'm a runner, and I have observed, like most runners have over the last 25 or 30 years, how utterly dominant the Kenyans and the Ethiopians have been in long-distance running. And this has prompted all kinds of people to say that this must represent some fundamental difference in underlying levels of ability, that there must be something peculiar about the genetic makeup of East Africans that makes them better runners than the rest of us. That's a talent explanation, right? But a far more elegant and persuasive and simpler explanation for them is that they have a higher level of capitalization than we do. Alberto Salazar, who's the great American marathoner, he recently pointed out that in Kenya there are probably 1 million schoolboys between the age of 10 and 17 years of age who run around 10 to 12 miles a day. Right? 1 million boys running 10 to 12 miles a day between the age of 12 and 17. The same number in the United States is probably 5,000, if that. Right? So our capitalization rate when it comes to distance running, what is it? It's surely less than 1%, right? It's probably 0.5%. Right? How many kids who are capable of being great long-distance runners in the United States ever discover whether they have that ability? They never do, because they never actually do the work necessary to find it. But in Kenya, how many great distance runners do they miss if they have 1 million schoolboys running 10 miles a day? Almost none. Their capitalization rate is probably 95%. That's the difference. Right? The difference has to do with what does the culture value and where does it spend its time and attention and how good is it at finding and making and exploiting that kind of human potential. They're really good at that when it comes to distance running, and we're not. And I think when you think about things that way, it powerfully clarifies how you go about improving our use of human potential. It means that you don't give up. It means that you don't say, look at a group that's not succeeding and say they are incapable of success, and say that the problems that they face are too powerful, too innate, too ingrained for us to do anything about. The capitalization argument, I think, enables us. It empowers us. It tells us that we can actually make a profound difference in how well people turn out if we choose to pay attention to the constraints imposed by poverty, by stupidity, and by attitude. So that's a little glimmer of the kinds of things that I'm wrestling with in this book. There's many more, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that any of you have.
I hate that you didn't mention the Beatles once. I really like that one, 10,000 hours. I don't know if you mentioned people who are over 40 or 50 can't spend 10,000 hours doing something. What do you suggest to us to become outliers?
Oh, this is the question is in reference to, I talk in the book at one point about how long does it take to be good at something? And this observation by many psychologists that, to master a cognitively complex task, whether it's playing chess at an elite level or being a brain surgeon or a classical music composer or a good computer programmer, requires, seemingly without exception, 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. So 10,000 hours is roughly 4 hours a day for 10 years. So you need to put in that kind of time before even the most talented of people, innately talented of people, can ever achieve an elite status. But I would actually, I don't think this argument, that observation, suggests that people who are older in life, that this is closing doors to people who are older in life. On the contrary, I think it suggests the opposite. That it says that at any point in our lives, if we are in a position to apply ourselves in a formal and rigorous and intensive way to a problem, we should be able to see fruits of that. It says, in other words, that what is special about people who do highly extraordinary or creative acts is not that they are, there's something special, something inherent in their minds, some particular genius, or that there is some magical property associated with youth. Right? On the contrary, it says that no, what sets them apart is that simply that what we are seeing is the necessary and predictable outcome of applying oneself rigorously to a task, something that is available to anyone at any point in their life if they choose to apply themselves in that way. So I think it's a liberating observation. Sure.
So Little League Baseball has a cutoff date May 1st. And I wonder what is the best mitigation strategy for a boy who wants to play T-ball and is born on April 27th?
Yeah. So the question was about Little League Baseball. Little League Baseball has a cutoff in midsummer or early summer. And in fact, if you look at the distribution of birth dates of baseball players, professional baseball players in America, you will see that they are highly clustered in the late summer months. Most baseball players are June, July, August, or July, August, September. I've forgotten exactly where the... so we see the same effect very clearly with baseball. What does the kid who was born on April 27th do? Well, in a certain way, nothing. There's nothing you can do. This is one of the things that I, in writing this book, was objecting to, was this strain in American thinking that says that all obstacles are ultimately overcomable by individuals if that individual simply chooses to be determined enough. I think that's very true, and persistence and determination are incredibly important components of success. But we also have to understand that when it comes to stupidity constraints, there is very little that individuals can do. That's the reason. That's why we call them stupidity constraints, because they have been stupidly imposed on a collective level and are powerful enough to overcome even really, really determined individuals. There are certain things that can only be done at the society level, right? And it is only our naive, like I said, only our naive faith in the efficiency and fairness of meritocratic systems that prevents us from seeing this. The only thing you can do for the kid born April 27th who wants to be a baseball player is do what I talked about, is create parallel leagues based on physical maturity. That's the way you do it. And it is if you look, when I read that roster list for those Czech teams, there are lots and lots and lots of kids in the Czech Republic who want to be successful soccer or hockey players, but who happen to be born at the end of the year. And you can see, there's the evidence. They're not getting it. They're not making it, right? It's not enough to ask the individual to try harder. Sure, back.
Yeah, so I was kind of wondering as I read through the book if, given that it's kind of about constraints placed somewhat arbitrarily. And if you came across any examples in your research of sort of outliers of those theories, in other words, people that managed to succeed at certain things despite those constraints.
Yeah. So yeah, this is a very interesting question. So this is something I've thought about a lot subsequent to this. So the book identifies, I'm really interested in this book in advantages that are advantages, meaning the kinds of opportunities and advantages that end up putting you further ahead than you would have been otherwise, right? But that's clearly only one of 4 conditions. There are also advantages that are disadvantages. So if your father is worth $1 billion, do you think that you would be, as a kid, better off or worse off today, right, than you would be if your father made $100,000? I would rather have a dad who made $100,000 than $1 billion. Right? I think that having a father with $1 billion would actually be quite crippling to your motivation, and so that's an advantage. That's actually a disadvantage, right? So then there's also disadvantages that are disadvantages. So that would be that's condition 3, and that would be to grow up the child of a single mother who's addicted to drugs in East Memphis is a disadvantage. That's a disadvantage. You really, almost no one overcomes that, right? But what you're asking about is the 4th condition, which is, are there disadvantages that are advantages? Now that is the most fascinating one of all. So, for example, one of the most fascinating observations that's been made in recent years is that someone did a study recently that pointed out that 30% of American entrepreneurs have been diagnosed at some point in their life with a profound learning disability. And you only have the list of people who fall into this category. So the dyslexics, Branson's a dyslexic, Charles Schwab is a dyslexic, the guy who founded Kinko's is a dyslexic. I can go on. I mean, the list is like this long, right? So why is that? Well, the argument is that it's not a coincidence. Is in fact, it is a direct function. Their entrepreneurialism is a direct function of their disability. So how do you succeed if you cannot read or write from the very earliest stages in your elementary education? You compensate for that if you're the ones who make it. A lot of kids don't make it, but those who do compensate. How do they compensate? Well, from the very earliest age, you learn how to delegate. So kids who make it through school, who can't read or write, you know how they do it? They do it by having others do their reading and writing for them, right? You compensate by being a really good oral communicator. You can't write or read, so you're a talker, right? You learn how to problem solve, right? Because your life is one big problem. You're in an institution that asks you to do 2 things and you can't do either of them, right? And you learn how to be a leader. You have to do all those things, problem solve, delegate, oral communicate. You learn how to lead. In fact, there's a beautiful study that was also done that pointed out that of dyslexic entrepreneurs, 80% of them were a captain of a high school sports team versus 30% of non-dyslexic entrepreneurs. That's the character type, right? So when you get into the real world, and what is required of an entrepreneur? That they be a good leader, that they delegate, that they be a problem solver, and that they be good oral communicators. These people have been spending their whole life practicing the 4 skills that are at the cornerstone of entrepreneurial success. Now, if you talk to those people and you ask John Chambers, dyslexic, right, has difficulty reading his own email, right? You ask all those guys, what role did dyslexia play in your success? They would say, it wasn't an obstacle that I had to overcome. It is in fact the reason I'm successful. It is a disadvantage that ended up being an advantage. Now, this category to me is the most fascinating one of all. So let me give you another example. One of the most striking findings in educational research is that there's almost no payoff that we can find to reducing class size. Even though all parents are obsessed with class size, right? Irrationally so. Your kid is in a class size of 25 and you hear that at some other school it's 19, and so you pay $25,000 a year to get your kid into the school with the 19 kids instead of the 25, right? In fact, reams and reams and reams of academic studies have failed to show any advantage to smaller class sizes except for really disadvantaged kids in very, very early grades. For everyone else, it's a total wash. Why is it a wash? Because it makes no sense. Why would you do just as well in a class where the teacher's not paying you as much attention, right? Shouldn't there be a correlation between teacher inputs and student performance? Yes, but only if there is no such thing as a disadvantage that can be an advantage. What if the disadvantage of being in a large classroom is something that you compensate for? What if it's like dyslexia? What if you're one of 30 kids, you compensate and learn self-reliance, and that self-reliance in the end is just as important a trait as the thing that you would get from a heavy amount of teacher feedback, right? We are resolutely uninterested in the category of benefits that fall into that fourth category, right? We can't even talk about them. No one wants to talk about what are the kind of customized disadvantages that we might introduce into our school system that might have a positive effect, right? And we operate under this extraordinarily psychologically naive notion that the only thing that matters in school are advantages that are advantages, right? As if everything else didn't exist. Like, I would love to see, for example, I'm now ranting on and on, but it is not like, I live in Manhattan. In Manhattan, we have these super, super, super fancy private schools. The most advantaged private schools in the world, right? That cost 30 grand a year, high schools. I'm not convinced that those schools don't fall into the category of advantages that are disadvantages. I would love to know on a kind of see a systematic analysis of whether you're helped. Why is it the case that you're better off going to that school than learning how to cope in a far more heterogeneous, rough and tumble public school environment? It's not obvious to me why that's. In fact, most of the successful people who send their kids to those schools went to rough and tumble, heterogeneous public schools. So it is this massive act of cognitive dissonance that you turn on the very thing that clearly made you successful and deny it to your child, right? In the name of what, right? The same grandfather who says that he walked 7 miles to school every morning barefoot drives his grandchild in the SUV 2 blocks to school because it's raining out. If it worked for you, Grandpa, why doesn't it work for me? Right?
Other possible cultural explanations for success, like you compared Asian to Western, but even within Western, I read a lot of studies that try to explain, for example, if it's genetic or cultural, that there are more Nobel Prizes amongst Jews or Western European, Eastern European Jews. And
yeah.
Is there any way to debunk that, per se?
Yeah, a lot of advantages, Jewish advantages, are shared by other ethnic groups who are in a similar sociological position. So the Parsis in India, the Lebanese throughout the world, the ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia and Vietnam, and I mean, I could go on, but there's a whole series of groups that if you look closely at the roles they have played and the success they have achieved, they're all doing the same thing. So Jews are not anomalous. They're not anomalous at all. They are part of a pattern of accomplishment that is common to these discrete ethnic minorities within larger countries. And a lot of that has to do with the kind of extraordinary set of, there are a series of disadvantages that come with being in that position, but there are also a set of advantages. So outsider status, being this kind of minority outsider group, is incredibly useful if you would like to play any sort of middleman role, right? Which what all those groups do, Lebanese, Parsi, ethnic Chinese, and Jews always invariably end up playing this entrepreneurial middleman role, which is something that is uniquely available to the outsider because the outsider, as an outsider, is allowed to do things that you can't do if you're a member of a majority. You can be tough. You can say no. If you're going to be a banker, right, where you're, I mean, this does not apply to the bankers on Wall Street over the last 10 years, but historically, if you were a banker, your success depended on your ability to say no, right? And to be mean, to say to someone who is not paying, you got to pay, right? It's really hard to do that if you're a member of the majority culture because you risk your social standing when you stand up to someone and put your foot down. But if you're a member of a minority group that's outside the general culture, you can be tough. You can say no, right? So that's why you see banking is always dominated by those four groups throughout the, my mother grew up in Jamaica. The Jamaican, it's funny, actually, Jamaica is a perfect example of this. The entrepreneurial commercial class of Jamaica is ethnic Chinese, Jewish, and Lebanese, right? So it's an exact indication of this very thing. So we could play with that idea and come to an understanding of all kinds of patterns of accomplishment in those groups. Because all those groups also have disproportionate professional success and disproportionate intellectual, to some extent, disproportionate intellectual success as well. I feel like I'm discriminating against the back of the room.
Referring to the 10,000 hour idea, in your opinion, what is it, how difficult is it to be successful in today's time period where we're at right now, as opposed to maybe the Great Depression?
As opposed to?
Maybe the Great Depression or recession.
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think it's easier in the sense that there are just so many such an array of things to be good at now, right? Success was narrowly defined in the 30s as being a doctor or a lawyer. Today we have, 25 different things that we would accord that same status to, or at least after the meltdown on Wall Street, 24. Sorry, I can't resist the Wall Street digs. So in that sense, if you think about the kinds of things that are available to those who are willing to put 10,000 hours of practice in, the list is just longer now. And so in that sense, I would say that we're at an advantage.
To how Bill Gates worked towards his achievement, and 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. at UW programming, and seeing that success before it actually became what we're all here doing now.
Oh, I see. Well, there's always going to be, we're in this. That kind of question is unanswerable because it requires us to know what the next. The thing about people of Bill Gates' generation was that they were getting their 10,000 hours in a discipline before the rest of the world realized that that was the discipline that mattered, right? By definition, we do not know what that discipline is today. Only the 15-year-old equivalent of Bill Gates does. So those of you with 15-year-old children should ask them. But, I'm not going to know. Sure.
The culture of honor in Arlington, Kentucky a little bit. I found that really fascinating.
Yeah, so I have in the culture section of the book, I talk about, I'm trying to set up the discussion of Asians and math. Because the hard thing to understand about the kind of cultural explanation I give for Asian mathematics superiority is this notion that the kids who are doing well in math today in South Korea or Singapore or where have you, Japan, are not themselves rice farmers, nor their parents, nor in some cases are their grandparents, right? So how is it possible that rice farming could be the explanation for the way they are? Well, in order to buy that, you have to buy the idea that cultural models and codes and rules persist, that long after the circumstances that created them have gone away, those things are still in the air, and they don't peter out or vanish. They stick around. And so I give an account, an explanation for why Appalachia in America has always been the most violent part of the United States. And the explanation for that is not in the particular immediate conditions of Appalachian life. It has to do with where the ancestors of those living in Appalachia come from. And many of them, that Appalachia was settled by people, by the Scotch-Irish, people from the borderlands of the United Kingdom, who had developed in their time, their hundreds of years there, in that most kind of lawless and dangerous and barren existence, had developed this thing called a culture of honor, which was a culture where your honor was everything and where you would do anything to defend it. And that is precisely the kind of culture that leads to lots and lots and lots of violence. But it was that whole section of the book is preparing us for the notion, for the seemingly counterintuitive notion, that what your great-great-great-great-grandparents did for a living can make a difference in how you see the world, which is not an obvious, it's a difficult point, I think, for many people to grasp. Sure.
You made a great case for the 10,000 hours of work it takes to become exceptionally good and at something, and then also for the people that are basically at a disadvantage. But I'm wondering about where you have a loss to society, where you only have so many slots. So for instance, if you had a better pathway for the Czech team so that the people were equally distributed, would they have a better team?
Yeah, I think it stands to reason that the Czechs, so suppose the Czechs have, or the Canadians, let's use the Canadians since I'm Canadian. Suppose the Canadians had 3 parallel leagues. Then their denominator of kids that they're choosing from, I think, if you look at the distribution now, you can make a reasonable inference that the cap rate is 40%, right? If we can raise the capitalization rate to 80%, we have doubled the available pool of kids that we're choosing from for the most elite level. So it doesn't change the same number of people. There's only a limited number of slots in the National Hockey League, but it stands to reason if the pool that you're pulling from is twice as big, the average level of talent should be higher. That you should, in other words, be able to raise the median level of talent in the league if you've increased your the pool you're fishing in.
Follow?
Okay.
Okay.
I know I'm about to get totally smoked, but go ahead.
So then you would expect that the people that were born later in the year on the Czech team or on all these teams would possibly be better than the ones that are born earlier.
Yeah, yes. Here's where it starts to get really, really interesting. You might. So they have overcome. Well, there are several things. Remember, they may simply be maturational anomalies. That is to say, not all. If you look at a group of 7-year-olds, they don't all mature at the same rate. It is mostly the case that the kids born in January are going to be bigger and stronger than the kids born in December. But some of the December-borns at the age of 10 or 11 are going to be as mature as those born in January. I think what you're seeing is that those are the kids who end up making the NHL. They're just ones whose growth curve was a little bit accelerated. I think that's the... although I don't know. It's a very good question. It would be worth looking into. But I did look at the list of the greatest hockey players ever, and they're almost all January, February, March. So
does it play into the ability, the cap rate, the ability to take advantage of, like you were talking about, the East African runners, the million that have there, but their system is not able to do anything with that. So yes, the quality of the ones who make it through. There's a great conversation that's happening here across Microsoft around innovation, and part where the idea is how do we dig in and find innovation where it is? It's not always just coming out of MSR. There might be, we're bad at finding ideas, great innovation in other parts of the company. Somebody that's in operations or support has a great idea, but if there's not the mechanisms to pull that out and do something with that, and so there's this downward pressure on the stupidity factor of not allowing us to find those ideas, as well as the upward push in trying to share those.
Yeah, so this is a good point. So to go back to your point as well. So one way, imagine, it's as a thought experiment. Let's just use hockey, for example. Suppose we wanted to increase the cap rate in hockey in Canada. One way to do it is to do what I'm talking about, which is not to increase the number of slots in the National Hockey League, but simply to increase the number of developmental leagues to have this kind of. But another way is to increase the slots. Suppose, as a thought experiment, we double the size of the National Hockey League, and we say we're now going to have 30 teams, right? Would the expansion of that end have the effect of forcing a greater efficiency in the capitalization of hockey teams of hockey in the developmental leagues? I mean, in other words, are there two ways to do this? Can you do this bottom up, or can you do this top down? The only I would be curious. I'm curious about the top-down version because we have a version of it in this country right now, right, where you have companies like Microsoft, which a whole tier of high technology companies, which are in have a perpetual shortage of very, very talented people, right? They're always complaining we can't find enough people to fill these kinds of slots. We got to go overseas. We got to all this kind of, and so in this case, it has not had the this perpetual shortage of very talented people has not really had the effect, I think, of dramatically raising our capitalization rates when it comes to math and science. In fact, over the course of the last 25 or 30 years, the relative performance of the United States in math and science seems to, if I have my numbers correctly, seems to have, if anything, eroded. So that suggests that maybe top-down, that supply side or demand side approaches. I always get them mixed up. One of them, you know what I'm talking about. Increasing the number of slots at the top may not be the best way to do it. Although but it's open to, it's worth, thinking about all these various scenarios. Sure.
So do you think when companies invest in communities by having math programs and all this, that a lot of that effort's going to be wasted because the societal underpinnings aren't there like you described?
Yeah. Yeah, you need to have a kind of, there has to be, like to go back to the Kenyan runners, for example. So they do have, there's an awful lot of, it's actually incredibly wasteful to have a 90% capitalization rate for distance running. You don't actually want 1 million of your 12-year-olds running 10 miles a day because you only have 4 spots on the Olympic team or whatever, 3 spots on the Olympic team. You want them to be doing something that has some kind of ultimate payoff. So that's actually not a model we want to emulate. It's probably a good thing that we have a 1% capitalization rate, but we just shouldn't whine about our performance in long distance running. But as a result, but there are a whole series of like this is a totally wacky idea that I've been talking about with some people, which is suppose you suppose you set up a system that allowed individuals or groups or nonprofits to profit from raising cap rates. So suppose I go into to South Central LA, and I have a class of a first grade class, right? Now I know, actuarially speaking, looking at those kids in their socioeconomic background, that the amount of federal tax those kids will pay, like actuarially, 20, 30 years hence, is probably close to zero, right? You have to really be a member of the middle class to pay taxes these days. And the number of kids in the worst part of South Central who end up in the middle class is very, very small. So suppose I said so the cap rate, if we define capitalization as joining the middle class and paying federal taxes, the capitalization rate in a bad neighborhood in South Central is pretty much 0. Okay? So what if we said to anyone that if you can raise the capitalization rate in that group, I'll give you a cut of their federal taxes. So what if you said, just like it's like you could venture capital groups of kids, right? Now I'm just doing this as a kind of thought experiment. So we know because we're getting 0 federal tax dollars now, what would be so wrong to say, if you, Joe Smith, want to invest in this class of kids for the next 25 years, I'll give you 50% of their tax revenue in perpetuity. And so in other words, if you can get 3 computer programmers and 2 doctors out of this class of 30 kids, you're going to be a very, very rich man. And by the way, society will be way better, and the kids will be happier because they will have what they don't have now, which is someone who is actively interested in and capable of increasing their capitalization, right? Of getting the rate from 0 to whatever it is, 10, 15, 20, 35%. There's all people, when you tell that idea to people, very often people think, oh, that it just sounds so. You know what? It's whatever problems are with that idea, it's a lot better than what we have now, which is no one caring for the kids, right? But the point is that capitalization strategies change the discussion. They move us away from this. I am so sick of this relentless, absurd, exhausting focus on ability, which is just beside the point. And they move us away from that and move us towards this focus on the exploitation of the ability that's already there. And that's just a far more rational place to start. if we did everything in our power to exploit ability, and we still saw differences in outcomes, then we can talk talent, right? If in America we had 25 million high school kids running 12 miles a day, and we still were getting, smoked at the Olympics in the 10,000 meters, I will entertain every genetic argument you want about the difference between us and East Africans. But until we do that, it's a pointless argument, right? So that's why I think we need to be much more inventive in our thinking about capitalization.
What if that runners playing soccer, hockey, lacrosse, football, baseball, basketball, right? Like we spread our talent pool over many more sports than Pinion does.
Yeah. No, that was my point, that it's apples, and that because of those very, very great differences in the way in which athletic talent is capitalized in these two cultures, you can't draw any conclusions about innate ability. Yeah.
Have a higher capitalization rate. It's just diversified.
Yeah.
Just before Malcolm goes any further, I want to comment that he's going to have to leave the building because he has to go do a talk at the Gates Foundation, where I think he's going to be convincing them to make that investment in those kids or anything. But so I know everybody wants the book, and I did have Malcolm has pre-signed tons of copies of the book. So my question to you is, we can have Malcolm answer questions for all of us for the next 15 minutes, and then get in the car and get over the bridge, or he can sign and personalize books for a very few of you. So I'm thinking we're moving toward the questions. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Over there in the corner.
In the context of the capitalization, right? You were talking before about runners, and I'm a big track fan in Jamaica, an island of only about 1 million people. I think it's 1.5 million now. Produces a disproportionate amount of sprinters, and a lot of them run for other countries in the middle there. Do you think that falls into the same thing, even though they have a small pool of people who are available to them?
Yeah. Well, as you know, I'm half Jamaican, so I'm powerfully disposed to answer this question in a way that reflects most flatteringly on Jamaica. Jamaica it's a beautiful example of this, right? So in this long-running debate about nurture versus nature in running, in sprinting especially, the quote-unquote gene pool of Jamaica isn't any different than any number of other countries around the world, and yet Jamaica utterly dominates sprinting. This is a clear case where cap rates for sprinting in Jamaica must be very, very close to 90%. And I have no real evidence for this other than anecdotally. I was just in Jamaica for Christmas visiting my cousins, and I'm a runner, so I would go running around, in the little hills around my aunt's house. And it was this hilarious thing that's never happened to me anywhere else, that the sight of someone running in Jamaica just ignites some kind of thing in all passers-by. So here I am, running along down the road, and people slow down, wave, and some guy will be trudging along back from work, and he would go, run, run, run. Oh, he would run after me and run with me for it was just like this. And I realized it's an obsession, right? It's a complete obsession. And there is so much status associated with the act of running that if you have any, even remote ability in this area, you exploit it, right? And, Usain Bolt at this point is not since Bob Marley has there been someone who has ignited this degree of. So I think it's a beautiful illustration of what I'm talking about.
Sure. So you indicate that this is all based on kind of what society values is. So did you look at how long it would take a societal value change to impact the capitalization of the folks on it? Because we're going to enter a new phase of political life here. I think a lot of us are hoping that some new values pop out. Yeah. How long that those might take effect?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm a real optimist in. I believe these kinds of shifts can happen really quickly. And let's stick with sports for a moment, because sports is just an elegant way of. If you think about what happened after Title IX, is it Title IX? So I saw a friend of mine the other day who has a 12-year-old daughter. So she's 40-something. And she was talking about the difference that is between her upbringing and her daughter's. And my friend is an athletic person in the sense that she's, but she did not play any sports at all as a kid. So she grew up in an upper middle class family in Providence, Rhode Island, not some, sticky place like, Eastern Seaboard. It never even occurred to her to do sports. None. And in her daughter's life, sports is everything. I mean, not everything. They do the same amount of schoolwork she did, but they play so many organized sports she can't keep track of it. That is a capitalization. Our capitalization rate for women and soccer or basketball only 25 or 30 years ago was what? 5%, 2%, 3%? Today it's 50, 60, 70%. That's one generation. It's an incredible shift in what we think of in our kind of priorities in that particular area. That makes me profoundly optimistic about our ability to shift our capitalization, the focus of our interest in other more consequential areas. Because let's face it, that's not a very consequential area. But if we can do it with soccer, I feel like we can do it with all kinds of other things. Sure.
It feels like you're blindsided, so when the sport of giving you opportunities, you go. You were raising your hand just now? Yes. I don't have a question. I was doing it for you.
Are you on the blind side? Yes, that's right.
Okay. Thank you so much. So my question is about sort of the opposite of the positive impact of culture, and the one you called out particularly the rights movement on negative historical impacts of culture. And I really want to explore your thoughts around, let's take slavery, for example, and sort of the long-standing impact of slavery. And what are your thoughts about outliers within that community, black community, and then sort of throw on the Obama impact, what do you think that will make, and how long do you think that will take?
So the question was about, on the opposite side, thinking about how things like the legacy of slavery have impacted opportunity. And so in the last chapter of my book is a personal chapter, and it's the story of my mother's family. And it attempts to answer this very question. So my mother is a brown-skinned Jamaican, and one of the points, and she has had this, what anyone would consider a successful life. She grew up in a little tiny cottage in the middle of the hills of Jamaica and ended up a upper middle class professional in Canada, right? And I try to tell her story using the ideas of the book and focus not on her own pluck and intelligence, but on what are the kinds of opportunities that allowed her to do that. And one of the things that I got into was the peculiarities of being a brown-skinned Jamaican. And I trace my mother's family history back to in the 1700s, a plantation owner from Ireland comes to Jamaica and takes as his concubine, basically I'm sure just bought and raped, an African slave. And that's the beginning of their son, a guy named John Ford, was the beginning of my mother's line, right? So in Jamaica, the mulatto offspring of a mixed-race union in the 1700s was not put back into slavery the way that child would have been in the American South. On the contrary, the Brits did this very, very different thing, which was if you were mixed race, you got welcomed into the ruling class. So John Ford, one generation removed from a slave ship, was a preacher. He was a literate, educated man who was a free man in 1790, whatever it was, and whose kids were free, and on and on. And if you trace my mother's family history down, along with the history of all these other parallel brown-skinned Jamaicans, you see a legacy of privilege that goes back generation upon generation upon generation. You see people who are members of the entrepreneurial and commercial and professional classes going back to the earliest days of the 19th century, right? Now, that has given them a status and a set of opportunities that are denied to people who were pushed back into slavery. There are equivalents in America who weren't plucked out in 1790 and allowed to get an education, but were pushed back in and enslaved for another 3 generations. There is a world of difference between starting from where my mother started from and starting from where she would have started from if her ancestors had been in Georgia or Alabama. Interestingly as well, along the same lines, Skip Gates, the professor of African American Studies at Harvard, did this really fascinating set of genealogical studies of prominent and successful African Americans and discovered that almost without fail, if you look back several generations into the families of these success stories, what you find is either someone who was a freed slave, so freed before emancipation, or a freed slave who managed in the first generation after emancipation to own land. In other words, you see the same thing, that success in the present day is a function of an opportunity that was created 2, 3, 4, 5 generations previously. Right? And that is when we're talking about this flip side, it reminds us that of how the shadow of slavery, those who were denied that kind of get out of jail free card that my mom got, or that these other people that Skip Gates looked at got, to be denied, for your ancestor to be denied that get out of jail free card matters even today. Right? So now you asked about Obama. What does the success of Obama tell us about the continuing significance of that legacy? Nothing. Right? Nothing. I mean, I love him as much as anyone. I could not be more thrilled about what's going to happen on Tuesday, right? I mean, a relief of cataclysmic... I might even become an American citizen now. But let's be clear. His victory does not mean that this issue is over, right? And if that is how we interpret it, then we're making a great mistake.
So then my follow-up question to that, for those people in the room or outside who are involved in trying to help a population of people who are victims of the very thing you described, what are some best practices or some things that people should look at to help create more successes? There are outliers, of course, and there are people who are not from mulatto backgrounds who've been successful, and there's something there, I don't understand it, but what are some of things to explore around creating more success stories?
Yeah. Well, that's I wish I could give you a kind of a complete and satisfying answer to that. And I don't know. I mean, in my book, I talk a little bit about just on this narrow question of how can you teach math to inner city kids? Can you get an inner city kid to think like an Asian when it comes to math? And the answer is yes. We've seen extraordinary results with teaching math by changing attitudes about work. And that makes me think that we have all kinds of opportunities in other areas. But what that effort looks like, I don't know. It's the kind of thing that I hope others will, I'm sure others are already pursuing, but that I think we need to know more about as a society. Right. One more question.
What are you going to write about next?
What am I writing about next? I have many ideas. One, I'll give you a little preview of my next New Yorker article, which is, there's two in the works. One is an attack on To Kill a Mockingbird. Because it turns out if you read, no one has read this book since you were like 12 years old, right? So what do you know when you're 12? Nothing. Reread it. That's all I'll tell you. And you discovered Atticus Finch, monster. Anyway, coming soon. And the other one, which will be even more near and dear to your hearts, and I can't give you details, but I'll give you the outline. And by the way, this is such a cool story. I haven't had one this cool in a long time. I met this guy from your world, software, entrepreneur, whatever. And you know the type. He's like, came from Mumbai, went to Caltech or MIT, $30 in his pocket, makes a name for himself in Silicon Valley. He has a daughter, and his daughter wants to play, she's 12 years old, she wants to play basketball, right? Now, he doesn't know anything about basketball. He's a software programmer from Mumbai. But he decides, I want to coach my daughter's basketball team. So he goes to a basketball game, and he observes it, right? As an outsider would, right? We're talking about outsiders. He's an outsider. He observes it, and he comes away shaking his head thinking, why do they play this game in such a mindless fashion? And so he decides to teach his daughter and her teammates to play the game his way, right? And what happens? Now, keep in mind, this team is a team of girls they're all from like Mountain View, and their fathers are all people like this guy. They're the children of software programmers. They are not big, huge, hulking mesomorphs with bulging muscles. They're like little skinny girls with pigtails, right? What happens? They almost win the state championship. They don't win the state championship because they get cheated in this outrageous way, which is one of the great parts of the story. But the whole point of the story, and it's just so on every level genius, it all has to do with what happens when a really, really smart guy from Mumbai decides to coach basketball. And the answer is nothing that you've ever seen on a basketball court before. And I'll only say this last little factoid, which is during the games when he's doing this thing that he does, and these little girls with pigtails. By the way, they're not good basketball players. P.S. They're not going to go and play like Division I. They're like little skinny girls they're all going to take physics at Caltech. They're not even interested in sports that much, but they're like under the tutelage of this mad genius. During the games, as they're coaching, the opposing coaches, who are the ones steeped in the older paradigm of basketball, get so enraged by what's happening that they start by just kind of sitting there in a stunned silence. Then they start screaming at their own girl. These 12-year-old girls start screaming at their own players as if it's their fault, right? And then, invariably, they challenge this guy to a fight in the parking lot after the game. Anyway, so look for that one too. Thank you all.